My sister broke into my apartment at 4 a.m. screaming, "Why is Mom's DNA on a crime database?" The crash of my front door slamming open jerked me from sleep so violently I fell out of bed. Before I could process what was happening, my sister Natalie was standing in my bedroom doorway, wild-eyed and breathing hard, her hair tangled and her face streaked with tears. She was holding her phone out like a weapon, the screen illuminating her face in harsh blue light. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, trying to make sense of the words she'd just screamed. Mom's DNA. Crime database. It was 4 a.m. on a Saturday and my sister had just kicked in my door. "Natalie, what the hell are you talking about?" My voice came out rough with sleep and confusion. She thrust her phone at me and I grabbed it, squinting at the screen. It showed what looked like a genealogy website, one of those DNA ancestry services that had become popular. But instead of the usual family tree graphics and ethnicity percentages, there was a red alert banner across the top reading, "Law Enforcement Match Identified." Below it was a case number, a jurisdiction listing, and a name I recognized immediately. Eleanor Reeves, our mother. The details said her DNA had been matched to evidence collected from a cold case investigation in 1994, the year before I was born, the year Natalie was 3 years old. I stared at the screen until the words stopped making sense, then looked up at my sister. "Where did you get this?" "I did one of those ancestry DNA tests 3 months ago," Natalie said, her voice shaking. "Just for fun, to see where our family came from. The results came back normal, nothing weird. But tonight I got an email saying there'd been a law enforcement match in my family tree. When I logged in, this is what I saw. Mom's DNA is flagged in a criminal database, Cameron. Our mother's DNA is connected to some kind of crime from 30 years ago." I handed the phone back and sat heavily on my bed. This had to be a mistake. Our mother was Eleanor Reeves, a retired school teacher who lived in a quiet suburb an hour away and spent her time gardening and volunteering at the library. She'd raised Natalie and me as a single mother after our father died when I was a baby. She'd never been in trouble with the law, never even had a speeding ticket that I knew of. The idea that her DNA was in a criminal database was absurd. "It's got to be an error," I said. "These ancestry sites make mistakes all the time. Maybe someone with a similar genetic profile got flagged and the algorithm confused it with Mom." Natalie shook her head violently. "I already thought of that. I called their customer service line and sat on hold for 2 hours. When I finally got someone, they confirmed the match was legitimate. They said law enforcement agencies can upload DNA profiles from crime scenes to search for familial matches. When I submitted my DNA, the system flagged it as a close genetic relative to DNA found at a crime scene in Bridgeport in 1994. The representative wouldn't tell me anything else, said I'd have to contact the police department directly for details about the case." She was pacing now, her movements jerky with panic. "I tried calling the Bridgeport police, but of course nobody's answering at 4 in the morning. I've been driving around for the past hour trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go home. I couldn't just sit with this information. So I came here." I stood up and grabbed sweatpants from the floor, pulling them on while my mind raced. "Okay, first thing, you need to calm down. We don't know what this actually means yet. Maybe Mom was a witness to something. Maybe she found a body, or helped someone who was involved in a crime." "Cameron, they don't put witness DNA in crime databases," Natalie snapped. "They put suspect DNA in crime databases. Evidence DNA, the kind they collect from crime scenes when someone commits a crime." The implications of what she was saying started to sink in. If our mother's DNA was connected to a 1994 crime scene in Bridgeport, that meant she'd been there. That meant she'd been involved somehow. I thought about Mom's life as we understood it. She'd grown up in upstate New York, gone to college in Vermont, then moved to Connecticut in her 20s. She'd worked as a substitute teacher before getting her full-time position at Riverside Elementary. She'd married our father, James Reeves, in 1989. He died in 1996 when I was 6 months old. She'd never remarried, never dated that I knew of, just focused on raising us and her career. There was nothing in that history that suggested criminal activity. "We need to talk to Mom," I said finally. "Right now, before we spiral into assumptions. Maybe there's a simple explanation we're not seeing." Natalie checked her phone. "It's 4:30 in the morning. She's not going to answer." "Then we drive to her house and wake her up," I said. "This isn't something that can wait." We took my car because Natalie was in no condition to drive. She sat in the passenger seat staring at her phone, refreshing the Ancestry website page like the information might change if she looked at it enough times. I focused on the dark highway, trying to organize my thoughts. What crime had happened in Bridgeport in 1994? I'd been born in 1995, so I had no memory of that time. Natalie would have been 3, also too young to remember. We'd have to search news archives, figure out what cases from that year might have DNA evidence on file. The drive to Mom's house took 40 minutes. By the time we pulled into her driveway, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The house was dark, no lights on yet. Mom was an early riser, but not this early. I killed the engine and we sat there for a moment, both of us suddenly hesitant. "What if she did something terrible?" Natalie asked quietly. "What if we're about to find out our mother is a criminal? Then we deal with it," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But we don't know anything yet. Let's not convict her before we have the facts." We got out and walked to the front door. I rang the doorbell and knocked loudly. Nothing. I knocked again. Harder. Finally, a light flicked on upstairs. A minute later, the porch light came on and the door opened. Mom stood there in her bathrobe, her graying hair messy from sleep, squinting at us in confusion. Cameron? Natalie? What's wrong? What are you doing here at this hour? She looked between our faces and her expression shifted to alarm. Is someone hurt? What happened? We need to talk to you, Natalie said, her voice tight. Right now. It's important. Mom opened the door wider and let us in. We followed her to the kitchen where she turned on lights and put on a pot of coffee with the automatic movements of routine. You're scaring me, she said, turning to face us. What's going on? Natalie pulled out her phone and brought up the Ancestry website, then held it out to Mom. I did a DNA test 3 months ago. Tonight I got notified about a law enforcement match. Your DNA, Mom. Your DNA is flagged in a crime database from 1994. Why is your DNA connected to a crime scene? Mom took the phone and looked at the screen. The color drained from her face so completely she went gray. She swayed slightly and grabbed the counter for support. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Just stared at the phone with an expression I'd never seen before. It was fear mixed with something else. Something that looked like resignation, like she'd been waiting for this moment for 30 years, and it had finally arrived. Mom, I said, stepping closer. What is this? What happened in 1994? She set the phone down carefully on the counter and lowered herself into a kitchen chair like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. Her hands were shaking. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was hoping you'd never find out. I spent 30 years making sure you'd never find out. Natalie made a sound like she'd been punched. Find out what? What did you do? Mom looked up at us and her eyes were filled with tears. I didn't kill anyone. I need you to know that first. I didn't kill anyone. The statement hung in the air, terrible in its specificity. She hadn't killed anyone. That meant whatever she'd done, it was serious enough that murder was a reasonable thing to deny. Then what did you do? I asked, my voice coming out harder than I'd intended. Tell us the truth, right now. Mom took a shaky breath. In 1994, I was working as a secretary at a law firm in Bridgeport. One of the junior partners, a man named Richard Voss, he was handling a case involving a drug trafficking ring. Very dangerous people, cartel connections. Richard had documents, evidence that could put a lot of people in prison. One night, someone broke into his apartment and killed him, stabbed him 17 times. The police never found who did it, and your DNA was at the scene, Natalie said flatly. Why was your DNA at the murder scene, Mom? Because I was there that night, Mom said. Richard and I were having an affair. I'd been at his apartment earlier that evening. We'd been together, intimate. I left around 10 p.m. He was alive when I left. 2 hours later, someone killed him. The room felt like it was tilting. Our mother had been having an affair with a murder victim. Her DNA would have been everywhere in that apartment, on sheets, on clothes, on his body. Did you tell the police? I asked. Did you tell them you'd been there? Mom shook her head. I was married to your father. You were on the way, she said, looking at Natalie. If I admitted I'd been there, I'd have to admit the affair. Your father would have left me. I'd have been the prime suspect in Richard's murder. My DNA was at the scene. I had access to his apartment. I knew about the case he was working on. It would have destroyed everything. So when the police questioned people at the law firm, I said I barely knew Richard. Said I'd never been to his apartment. I lied to the police during a murder investigation. Natalie backed away from her, horror written across her face. You let a murderer go free. Someone killed a man, and you had information that could have helped catch them. But you said nothing because you were worried about your marriage. I was terrified, Mom said, her voice breaking. I was 26 years old, pregnant, married to a man I didn't want to lose. The police never had any leads. Richard's murder went cold within months. I told myself that my testimony wouldn't have made a difference anyway, that I didn't see anything useful. But the truth is, I was a coward. I chose protecting my comfortable life over doing the right thing. I felt sick. This woman who'd taught us about honesty and integrity, who'd volunteered at the library and baked cookies for school fundraisers, had lied to police investigating a murder, had let evidence go unreported because it was inconvenient for her personally. What about Dad? I asked. Did he know? Your father never knew about the affair, Mom said. He died believing I'd been faithful to him. That's one mercy at least. Mercy! Natalie's voice was climbing toward hysterical. You think lying to your dying husband is mercy? You think covering up your involvement in a murder investigation is mercy? I didn't cover up a murder, Mom insisted. I covered up an affair. There's a difference. The legal system doesn't see a difference, I said. Lying to police during a murder investigation is obstruction of justice. Withholding evidence is a crime. You committed a crime, Mom. Multiple crimes. Mom stood up abruptly. I know what I did. I've lived with it every day for 30 years. But I built a good life. I raised you both to be good people. Doesn't that count for something? Not if it's built on lies, Natalie shot back. Not if an innocent person went to prison because you didn't speak up. Did anyone get arrested for Richard's murder? No, Mom admitted. The case is still unsolved. That's why the DNA is still in the database. They never closed it. So a killer is still out there, I said slowly, because you didn't tell the truth. Mom's face crumpled. I know. But going to the police now won't change anything. Richard is still dead. 30 years have passed. All it would do is destroy our family. Our family is already destroyed, Natalie said coldly. The minute you decided protecting yourself was more important than justice, you destroyed this family. We just didn't know it yet. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I followed her, unable to look at Mom anymore. Behind us, Mom called out, "Please don't do anything rash. Think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences." I turned back at the doorway. We're thinking about the consequences. Maybe you should have done that in 1994. We drove back to my apartment in silence. When we got there, the broken door was still hanging open from where Natalie had kicked it in. I'd have to call my landlord later, explain somehow without mentioning my family's criminal secrets. Natalie collapsed on my couch and buried her face in her hands. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Do we go to the police? Do we turn in our own mother?" I sat down next to her. "I don't know. Legally, we probably have an obligation to report what we know. Morally, I think we definitely do. But she's our mother. She raised us. Everything we are comes from her. Everything we are is built on a foundation of lies," Natalie said bitterly. "She taught us to value honesty while hiding the fact that she'd lied to police about a murder. She taught us about integrity while living with the knowledge that she'd obstructed justice. How do we reconcile that? How do we trust anything she ever told us?" Those were questions I couldn't answer. I pulled out my phone and started searching for news archives from 1994 Bridgeport. It didn't take long to find the story. Richard Voss, 32, junior partner at Brenner & Associates law firm, found stabbed to death in his apartment on March 15, 1994. The articles described him as a rising star in criminal defense, currently representing a client with alleged cartel ties. Police suspected the murder was connected to the case, but had no evidence to support the theory. No arrests were ever made. The case remained open, listed as a cold case on the Bridgeport police website. I showed Natalie the articles. She read through them, her expression getting darker with each paragraph. "He had a wife," she said, pointing at a photo accompanying one article. It showed a woman in her late 20s, dark hair, tear-stained face. Richard Voss left behind a wife, Angela, and a 4-year-old son. Mom was sleeping with a married man, and then she let his murder go unsolved. That wife spent 30 years not knowing who killed her husband. That son grew up without his father. We don't know if Mom's testimony would have made a difference, I said, playing devil's advocate, even though I didn't believe it. She said she didn't see anything useful. She didn't give the police a chance to determine what was useful, Natalie countered. Maybe she saw something she didn't realize was important. Maybe her timeline would have helped establish when the murder occurred. Maybe DNA evidence from her could have been used to rule out other suspects or narrow down forensics. We'll never know because she chose silence. She was right. I knew she was right. But the thought of turning in our mother, of watching her get arrested and prosecuted, of seeing our family torn apart publicly, made me feel ill. "We need to think this through," I said. "Not make any decisions while we're emotional. When exactly is the right time to decide whether to report that your mother obstructed a murder investigation?" Natalie asked. "What's the non-emotional timeline for that choice?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated, then answered on speaker so Natalie could hear. "Cameron, please come back," Mom said. Her voice was thick with tears. "Please let me explain properly. There's more to the story than what I told you." "What more could there possibly be?" I asked. "You had an affair. Your lover was murdered. You lied to police. That seems pretty comprehensive." "I lied to police because I was afraid of the wrong people," Mom said. "I didn't just lie to protect my marriage. I lied because I was terrified that whoever killed Richard would come after me next if they knew I'd been there. The people Richard was prosecuting, they were dangerous. They killed him to stop him from testifying. If they'd known about me, about what I might have seen, they would have killed me too." Natalie leaned toward the phone. "What did you see, Mom? What did you actually see that night?" There was a long pause. When Mom spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "When I left Richard's apartment around 10, there was a car parked across the street, a black sedan with tinted windows. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I remembered it because it seemed out of place in that neighborhood. Too expensive. Too new. When I walked to my car, I felt like I was being watched. The sedan started its engine but didn't follow me. I drove home thinking it was just paranoia. But the next day, when I heard Richard had been killed, I realized someone was watching his apartment. They were waiting for me to leave before they went in." "You saw the killers," I said, my voice flat. "You saw them and never told anyone." "I saw a car," Mom corrected. "I didn't see who was inside. I didn't get a license plate number. I couldn't describe the occupants. What was I supposed to tell the police? That I saw a black sedan? They'd have asked why I was there, what I was doing. It would have all come out. And, for what? A vague description of a common car? It might have been enough," Natalie said. "Combined with other evidence, witness statements, it might have been the piece that solved the case. But you'll never know, because you were too much of a coward to find out." "I was trying to survive," Mom said, her voice hardening. "I was trying to protect myself and my unborn child from cartel hitmen. I'm sorry that doesn't meet your moral standards, Natalie, but I did what I thought I had to do. And now, I asked. What happens now that we know? Now you have to decide, Mom said. Are you going to destroy your mother to satisfy some abstract principle of justice? Are you going to send me to prison for a 30-year-old lie? Because that's what reporting this will do. I'll be charged with obstruction, probably more. I could spend the rest of my life in prison. Maybe that's what you deserve, Natalie said coldly. Mom was quiet for a moment. Maybe it is, but before you decide, think about what it will cost. Think about your lives, your careers. Cameron, you're applying for that promotion at the engineering firm. How do you think they'll react when it comes out that your mother obstructed a murder investigation? Natalie, you're up for partner at your consulting company. You think they'll promote someone whose family is embroiled in a criminal scandal? The threat was implicit but clear. If we reported her, we'd all suffer. Our reputations, our careers, our futures would be tied to her crimes. It was emotional blackmail, and the fact that it was coming from our mother made it even worse. You're threatening us now? I asked, disbelief coloring my voice. You're actually threatening your own children to keep us quiet? I'm not threatening you, Mom said. I'm asking you to consider the consequences of your choices. I'm asking you to think about whether justice for a 30-year-old crime is worth destroying 3 more lives. I'm asking you to show me the mercy I failed to show Richard's memory. She hung up before we could respond. Natalie and I sat in silence, processing what we'd just heard. Our mother had witnessed something that might have helped catch a killer, and she'd stayed silent for 3 decades. Now she was asking us to do the same, to become complicit in her cover-up. I can't do this, Natalie said finally. I can't look at her and pretend I don't know what she did. I can't go to family dinners and smile like everything's fine. I can't live with this secret. So what's the alternative? I asked. We go to the police, she gets arrested, our family explodes, and maybe nothing even changes in the original case because her evidence is 30 years old and probably useless now. At least we'd be telling the truth, Natalie said. At least we wouldn't be carrying her lies forward into another generation. She had a point. If we stayed silent, we became part of the cover-up. We became accessories after the fact, knowing about a crime and failing to report it. But if we spoke up, we'd be responsible for sending our mother to prison, for destroying the family she'd built, for validating her worst fears about what would happen if the truth came out. Neither option felt right. Both felt like betrayal. I spent the rest of that Saturday researching obstruction of justice laws, statutes of limitations, and what actually happened when people came forward with information about old crimes. The legal landscape was complicated. Obstruction charges could potentially still be filed since the underlying murder case remained open, but prosecutors would have to weigh the public interest in pursuing charges against a 60-year-old woman for a decades-old lie. The actual usefulness of her testimony after so much time was questionable. Memory degraded, details faded, and whatever she might have seen in that moment had been filtered through 30 years of guilt and fear and self-justification. But there was another consideration I couldn't ignore. Richard Voss's widow, Angela, was still alive. I'd found her obituary for reference while researching, wanting to know if she'd passed, but there was none. That meant somewhere out there was a woman who'd spent 30 years wondering who killed her husband and why. Their son would be 34 now, grown up without his father. They deserved to know that someone had information, even if that information was limited and late. Sunday morning, Natalie called me. I made a decision, she said. I'm going to the Bridgeport police tomorrow. I'm going to tell them what we know. You can come with me or not, but I'm doing this. Natalie, wait. Let's think about this more. Let's talk to a lawyer first, figure out what our legal exposure is. I don't care about legal exposure, she said. I care about being able to look at myself in the mirror. I care about not becoming the kind of person who lets murderers walk free because it's convenient. Mom made her choice 30 years ago. I'm making mine now. I couldn't argue with her conviction even though part of me wanted to. Okay, I said. I'll come with you. We do this together. Monday morning, we met at the Bridgeport Police Department. The building was older, brick and concrete, with the worn look of a government facility that had seen better days. We asked to speak to someone about a cold case from 1994 and were directed to the detective unit on the 3rd floor. Detective Laura Mendoza met us in a small interview room. She was in her 50s, Hispanic, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. When we explained why we were there, those sharp eyes got sharper. You're saying your mother was at Richard Voss's apartment the night he was murdered and never told anyone? She asked, pulling out a notepad. That's correct, Natalie said. She was having an affair with him. She left his apartment around 10 p.m. He was alive when she left. She also saw a suspicious vehicle parked outside, a black sedan, but she never reported any of this because she didn't want anyone to know about the affair. Detective Mendoza wrote rapidly. Your mother's name is Eleanor Reeves? Yes, I confirmed. She was Eleanor Hartford then, her maiden name. She got married to our father, James Reeves, in 1989. And you're coming forward now because? Detective Mendoza looked between us. Because my ancestry DNA test triggered a familial match in your database, Natalie explained. We confronted our mother and she admitted what happened. We felt we had an obligation to report it. Detective Mendoza nodded slowly. I'm going to be honest with you. This is going to open a significant investigation, and your mother will likely face charges for obstruction of justice and making false statements to police. The statute of limitations on those charges may have expired depending on specific circumstances, but we'll need to review everything. You understand that by coming forward, you're potentially putting your mother in legal jeopardy? We understand, I said, but a man was murdered and his killer was never caught. If our mother's information might help, even 30 years later, then it needs to be shared. Detective Mendoza spent the next 2 hours taking our statements, recording everything we knew about Mom's revelation. She asked detailed questions about when we'd learned the information, exactly what Mom had said, whether she'd mentioned any other details we hadn't already shared. Then she asked for Mom's current address and contact information. We'll need to interview her directly, she said. I'll be reaching out to her today. I want you both to know that this is the right thing you're doing. It's not easy to report a family member, but justice doesn't have an expiration date. Richard Voss's family deserves answers, even if they come decades late. We left the police station feeling wrung out and uncertain. What we'd just done felt both right and terrible. We'd upheld the law, told the truth, potentially helped solve a cold case. We'd also potentially destroyed our mother's life and torn our family apart permanently. My phone started ringing within the hour. Mom. I didn't answer. It rang again, and again. Finally, a text came through. The police just called. They want me to come in for an interview. What did you do? How could you betray me like this? I showed Natalie the text. She read it and her jaw tightened. We didn't betray her. She betrayed Richard Voss and his family. She betrayed the legal system. She betrayed the truth. We just stopped participating in the cover-up. Another text from Mom appeared. You've ruined everything. I hope you're happy. I hope it was worth destroying your mother to feel morally superior. She's not going to forgive this, I said. Maybe ever. I don't need her forgiveness, Natalie said. I need to be able to live with my choices, and I can live with this one. Over the next week, the situation escalated rapidly. Mom hired a lawyer, a criminal defense attorney who immediately advised her not to speak to police without representation. Detective Mendoza obtained a warrant for Mom's DNA to compare it officially to the crime scene evidence. The match was confirmed within days. DNA from skin cells and hair found on Richard Voss's body and in his apartment matched our mother genetically. She'd definitely been there the night of the murder. The Bridgeport police held a press conference announcing a break in the 30-year-old cold case of Richard Voss's murder. They didn't name Mom publicly yet, but they confirmed they'd identified a witness who'd been at the victim's apartment the night of the killing and failed to come forward. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Richard Voss's widow, Angela, now 62, gave a tearful interview saying she'd never given up hope that her husband's killer would be found. Their son, Daniel Voss, now a lawyer himself, spoke about growing up without his father and the hole that absence had left in his life. Watching them, I felt the weight of what Mom had done in a new way. These weren't abstract victims or theoretical concepts of justice. They were real people who'd suffered real loss, and Mom had chosen her comfort over their right to answers. Mom was charged with obstruction of justice and making false statements to law enforcement. Because the underlying murder case remained open and active, the statute of limitations on her charges hadn't expired. Her attorney argued that she'd been young, scared, pregnant, and traumatized by her lover's murder. He painted her as a victim of circumstance rather than a deliberate obstructor. The prosecutor countered that she'd made conscious choices to lie and withhold evidence, and those choices had potentially allowed a killer to escape justice. The case became a minor media sensation. The aging schoolteacher charged with covering up an affair and obstructing a murder investigation. The daughter who turned her in after a DNA test revealed family secrets. It was the kind of story that generated passionate opinions on both sides. Our extended family fractured along predictable lines. Mom's siblings and friends rallied around her, calling Natalie and me traitors and family destroyers. Some of our cousins reached out with support, saying we'd done the right thing. Others blocked us on social media and refused to speak to us at family gatherings we were no longer invited to. My employer was understanding but concerned about the publicity. Natalie's firm asked her to take a leave of absence until the media attention died down. We'd both become infamous by association, the children who'd reported their mother to police. The reopened investigation into Richard Voss's murder moved forward with new energy. Detectives re-interviewed everyone connected to the original case, reviewed all the physical evidence with modern forensic techniques, and followed up on leads that had gone cold decades ago. Mom's description of the black sedan, vague as it was, actually did prove useful when combined with other witness statements from that night. 2 other people had noticed the same vehicle but hadn't thought to report it. One had even partially noted the license plate. With that information, investigators were able to track the vehicle registration through old DMV records. It led them to a man named Victor Salazar, who'd been a known associate of the cartel members Richard Voss had been prosecuting. Salazar had died in 2003, killed in a prison fight while serving time for an unrelated conviction. But the connection gave police enough evidence to officially close the case as solved, attributing Richard's murder to cartel retaliation carried out by Salazar and likely one other person who was never identified. Angela Voss held a press conference after the case was officially closed. She stood next to her son Daniel and thanked the police for never giving up. Then she addressed Mom directly, speaking to the cameras. To the woman who was with my husband that night, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm not glad you're suffering consequences for your silence, even though those consequences are deserved. What I feel is sadness. Sadness that you lived 30 years with this secret. Sadness that fear and selfishness kept you from doing the right thing. Sadness that my son grew up without his father because you were too afraid to tell the truth. I hope you find peace somehow, but more than that, I hope you understand the real cost of your choices. The cost wasn't just to you. It was to everyone who loved Richard and needed answers about why he was taken from us. Her words haunted me for weeks. She'd managed to be both compassionate and devastating, acknowledging Mom's humanity while holding her accountable for the damage she'd caused. It was the kind of grace I wasn't sure I could have shown in her position. Mom's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Her attorney negotiated a plea deal. She'd plead guilty to obstruction of justice in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecutor recommended 18 months in prison, followed by probation. The judge would make the final decision. I attended the sentencing hearing. Natalie didn't. She said she couldn't watch Mom perform remorse she probably didn't feel. I understood but felt like I needed to be there, needed to see this through to whatever end it reached. Mom stood before the judge in a conservative blue suit, her hair styled, her face carefully composed. She read a prepared statement, expressing regret for her choices and apologizing to Richard Voss's family. The words sounded hollow to me, rehearsed and calculated to minimize her sentence, rather than genuinely reflecting remorse. But maybe that wasn't fair. Maybe she did feel genuine regret, and just didn't know how to express it after 30 years of denial. The judge listened to both sides, then delivered his ruling. Mrs. Reeves, you made choices 30 years ago that prioritized your personal comfort over justice for a murder victim. Those choices had consequences that rippled through decades, affecting not just Richard Voss's family, but the entire justice system's ability to solve his murder. Your age and lack of prior criminal history are mitigating factors, but they don't erase the severity of your actions. I'm sentencing you to 12 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. I hope you use this time to reflect on the real meaning of integrity and the importance of truth, even when that truth is inconvenient or frightening. Mom maintained her composure until they took her away in handcuffs. Then she finally broke, tears streaming down her face as she looked back at me one last time before the bailiff let her through the side door. I sat in the courtroom for a while after everyone else had left, processing what had just happened. My mother was going to prison, because of choices she'd made, yes, but also because Natalie and I had chosen to report her. We'd chosen truth over family loyalty, justice over protecting our mother. Whether that was right or wrong felt impossible to determine. Natalie called that evening. Is it over? She asked. She got 12 months, I told her. Plus probation. She'll probably be out in 9 months with good behavior. Good, Natalie said. Then, is good the right word? I don't know. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about any of this. Neither do I admitted. I keep thinking about what Detective Mendoza said, that justice doesn't have an expiration date. I believe that. But I also keep thinking about Mom raising us, teaching us, being there for every school event and illness and milestone. How do I reconcile those two versions of her? Maybe we don't, Natalie said. Maybe she's both, the mother who loved us and the woman who let a killer escape. Maybe people are just complicated and contradictory, and we have to accept that we'll never fully understand her choices. Over the following months, I visited Mom in prison twice. The visits were stilted and awkward, both of us struggling to find common ground around the chasm her crimes and our reporting had created between us. She never explicitly blamed us for turning her in, but the accusation hung in the air unspoken. During the second visit, I asked her something I'd been wondering. Do you regret the affair? Knowing how everything turned out, do you wish you'd never gotten involved with Richard Voss? Mom was quiet for a long time. I regret that he died. I regret that I wasn't brave enough to tell the truth. But the affair itself? No. Richard made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. For a few months, I was happy. That happiness cost him his life, and cost me everything else, but I can't honestly say I regret feeling it. The answer bothered me more than outright remorse would have. She couldn't separate the affair from its consequences, couldn't acknowledge that her happiness had been built on betrayal and had indirectly contributed to a man's death. Even now, even after prison and public shame, she couldn't fully accept responsibility. I stopped visiting after that. Natalie never visited at all. We both threw ourselves into our careers, trying to rebuild reputations that had been damaged by association with Mom's crimes. Slowly, the media attention faded. We became footnotes to a solved cold case, rather than main characters in an ongoing scandal. Mom was released from prison after 9 months. She moved to a small apartment in a different city, somewhere she could start over without everyone knowing her story. She called occasionally, stilted conversations about nothing important. We never discussed what had happened, never processed the trauma or the betrayal or the choices we'd all made. It was easier to pretend we were a normal family with normal distance rather than face what we'd become. 3 years after the initial DNA match, I got a letter from Daniel Voss, Richard's son. He wrote that he'd been following our story and wanted to thank us for coming forward, despite the personal cost. He said knowing what happened to his father, even if the actual killer was dead, had given him a sense of closure he'd never thought he'd find. He said he understood it must have been difficult to report our mother, but that, from his perspective, we'd done an incredibly brave thing. He hoped we found peace with our decision. I showed the letter to Natalie. She read it and smiled for the first time in months. Maybe it was worth it, she said. Maybe all the pain and the family fracturing and the consequences were worth giving them that closure. Do you think Mom will ever understand that? I asked. Natalie shook her head. No, I think Mom will go to her grave believing she was the victim in all of this. That we betrayed her, that the system punished her too harshly, that her choices were justified by circumstances. Some people never develop the self-awareness to see their own culpability. She was probably right, but I'd made my peace with that. We'd done what we thought was right, consequences and all. Justice didn't have an expiration date, and truth mattered even when it was painful. 5 years after the DNA match first appeared on that Ancestry website, I can say I don't regret reporting Mom. I regret that she made choices that required reporting. I regret that a man died and his family suffered for decades. I regret that our family was torn apart and may never fully heal. But I don't regret choosing truth over convenient silence. That night at 4 a.m. when Natalie broke into my apartment screaming about Mom's DNA, neither of us could have predicted where that revelation would lead. But it led us to a place where we could look at ourselves in the mirror and know we'd done the hard thing, the right thing, even when it cost us everything familiar and comfortable. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. Natalie built a new life that didn't revolve around family legacy or protecting secrets. She made partner at her firm, married someone who knew the whole story and loved her anyway, started a foundation that helped fund DNA testing for cold cases. She turned her pain into purpose, her family's failure into fuel for making sure other families got the answers ours had denied them. I did the same in my own way, volunteering with victim advocacy groups and speaking about the importance of coming forward with information, even when it implicates people you love. We found meaning in the wreckage, built something worth keeping from the ruins of what we'd lost. Mom sends Christmas cards every year. They arrive with generic messages and her new address printed neatly in the corner. We don't send cards back. The relationship we once had is gone, replaced by something distant and formal, more obituary than living connection. Maybe someday we'll find a way to rebuild, to forgive, if not forget. But that day hasn't come yet, and I'm not sure it ever will. What I do know is this. When my sister broke into my apartment at 4 a.m. screaming about DNA databases, she set in motion a chain of events that defined the rest of our lives. We chose truth. We chose justice. We chose the hard path instead of the easy lie. And whatever the cost, whatever we lost, I'd make the same choice again. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.